The chamber was quiet the way a graveyard is quiet, not peaceful, just empty of anything alive enough to make noise. 7 thrones sat in a wide circle above the clouds of Seneth Prime, held up by a station so old that 3 different species claimed they built it. The lights inside were soft gold, the kind that made everyone look important and wise, even when they were neither. The Galactic Accord Council had been meeting in this chamber for over 400 years. They had ended wars here. Started a few too, though they never called it that. They called it correction. They called it necessary action. They called it restoring order to the stars. Today they called it justice. Ambassador Drain of the Sulking spoke first, as he always did. He was tall, pale blue, with 6 fingers on each hand, and a voice that sounded like 2 people talking at the same time. He stood at the center of the circle and read from a long list, each item spoken clearly, each one meant to sound like proof. Humanity, he said, had violated 11 interstellar trade agreements. Humanity had refused 3 separate requests to submit to the Council's bioscan program, which tracked population data across the galaxy. Humanity had established colonies on 4 worlds that sat inside protected space, systems the Council had marked off-limits, dead worlds with no life, but still, the rule was the rule. And humanity had, on no fewer than 6 recorded occasions, told Council representatives to leave their space and not come back. And they had never apologized, not once. The other ambassadors listened. Some nodded. The Dravathi ambassador clicked his hard outer shell in a way that meant agreement. The Fenori pair, 2 small creatures who shared a single vote and always sat so close they looked like one, bobbed their heads together. The Tharak representative, huge and gray and old as stone, simply stared forward with the expression of someone who had already made up their mind before walking through the door. Only Admiral Ketra of the Voreth was still. He sat with his 4 arms folded, his 4 eyes moving slowly around the room. He was the only military mind on the Council. Everyone else was a diplomat or a politician. He was neither. He was a person who had spent 60 years studying how wars were won and lost, and right now, watching his colleagues nod and click and agree, he felt something cold moving through his chest. The vote was fast, 6 in favor, 1 against. Ketra's hand stayed down. Drain looked at him with something between pity and annoyance. "Your objection, Admiral." Ketra was quiet for a moment. Then he said, slowly and clearly, "You have never seen them truly angry." Nobody answered that. Nobody thought it needed an answer. The declaration was written, sealed, and sent. It went out on every frequency, in every language used across the known galaxy, including all 7 of humanity's main dialects. It reached every human ship, every colony, every deep space station, every lonely little outpost sitting at the edge of explored space. The message was simple, though the wording was long. It said that humanity was in violation of Council law. It said that humanity had been given chances to correct this and had refused. It said that, as of the moment of transmission, the Galactic Accord Council had formally declared a state of war between the Council and the human species. It gave humanity 72 hours to lay down its weapons, recall its military vessels, and submit to Council authority. It also said, near the end, in smaller text that was still clearly meant to be read, that humanity's continued refusal to cooperate had been noted as a sign of primitive political development, and that the Council hoped this action would help human civilization mature into a responsible member of galactic society. That last part was not necessary. Someone had added it anyway. The Council adjourned. There was no celebration, but there was satisfaction, the kind that comes from finally doing something you had been putting off for too long. Drain spoke briefly to the Dravathi ambassador as they walked toward the exit, and the words swift resolution and minimal resistance passed between them like a done deal. Ketra did not walk with them. He stood at the great window and looked out at the stars for a long time. The ISV Relentless was not a pretty ship. It had been built for work, not show, long and dark, with a hull that had been patched so many times in different metals that it looked like a quilt someone had made during a power outage. It was a deep reconnaissance vessel, which meant its job was to go far out into the dark, find things, and come back with information. It was fast, quiet, and crewed by people who did not mind being far from home for long stretches of time. Commander Lyra Voss had captained it for 9 years. She was not tall, not impressive to look at, not the kind of person a stranger would notice walking through a crowd. Medium height, dark hair cut short and practical, a face that had spent too many years under recycled ship air and artificial light. She had a small scar along her left jaw from a mission she never talked about, and she had the habit of going very, very still when she was thinking hard about something. She was very still now. The transmission had come in 40 minutes ago. She had read it once fast, then twice slowly, then a third time even slower. The datapad sat on the console in front of her. Her coffee was beside it, going cold. The bridge was empty except for her and the soft hum of the ship's systems and the quiet voice of Myra, the ship's AI, who had been waiting patiently without saying a word. The stars outside the viewport moved slowly as the Relentless drifted on its patrol route. A long, quiet stretch of nothing in every direction, just the dark and the light of distant suns. Lyra read the last line of the transmission one more time, the one about primitive political development, the one about helping humanity mature. She set the datapad down. She thought about the 6 wars she had served in before this one. 3 of them were wars the history books remembered. 3 of them were the kind that never got official names because the people who authorized them didn't want the paperwork. She thought about the people she had served with, most of them still alive, some of them not. She thought about the colonies, the real ones, the ones she had been to, small and hard and full of people who had gone out to the edge of explored space with nothing but tools and hope, and the stubborn human belief that it was worth trying. She thought about what it meant for someone to look at all of that and call it primitive. She was quiet for a long time. Myra's voice came gently through the bridge speakers, calm, patient, a voice designed to be easy to hear without being startling. "Your orders, Commander." The ship drifted. The stars moved slowly past the viewport. Somewhere, 6 ambassadors were already planning what to do with a humanity that rolled over and gave up. Lyra reached out and picked up her coffee. She took one sip, even though it was cold, because she had learned a long time ago not to waste things. Then she set it back down, and the corner of her mouth moved just a small thing, just barely, the kind of expression that someone else might miss if they were not paying close attention. But Myra was always paying attention. Finally, Lyra said. The word came out quietly, no anger in it, no fear, no excitement even, just a kind of deep, settled calm, the calm of someone who had been waiting a long time for something to become simple, and it had finally become simple. She reached forward and opened a channel to the crew. "All hands," she said, "this is the commander. We have received a transmission from the Galactic Accord Council. I am sending it to your personal terminals now. Read it, then get some sleep. We have a long road ahead and I want everyone sharp." She paused just for a second. "We're going to be fine," she added, "trust me." She closed the channel and started working. The Relentless moved quietly through the dark, and the 72-hour clock began. The council expected noise. That was the honest truth of it, though none of them would have said it out loud in those words. They expected transmissions, panicked calls from human colony governors, emergency broadcasts from their military command, angry speeches, maybe, or desperate ones. Some kind of signal that the declaration had landed and that humanity was scrambling to respond, arguing, dividing, the way they always seemed to do when something went wrong. What they got was silence. Not the silence of an empty channel, not static, not a technical problem, just nothing. Humanity received the declaration, and then humanity went quiet, and the quiet stretched out across the 72 hours like a held breath. and not a single human representative contacted the council to negotiate, surrender, object, or even ask a question. By hour 40, some of the ambassadors were beginning to feel uneasy, though they told themselves and each other that this was simply the silence of a species that knew it was beaten and had not yet found the words to admit it. Ketra did not say anything. He spent those 40 hours in his private office reading files he had pulled from the council's own historical archives, old records, some of them dusty with disuse, from the early days of first contact with humanity. He read them slowly and carefully, and the cold thing in his chest got colder. The other species of the Galactic Accord had stories about how they reached the stars. The sulking told theirs often because it was beautiful, a long age of peace and philosophy, centuries of slow and steady scientific progress, a species that looked up at the sky and thought, "We should go there," and then went gently and with care. Their first contact with another species had been warm. They had exchanged art. They had exchanged music. They had built a friendship that lasted to this day. The Voreth story was harder. There had been a long war on their homeworld, a bad one, and when it ended, the surviving nations had agreed that going to space together was better than dying apart. It was a story about choosing peace after pain. Ketra had grown up proud of that story. The Dravathi had been guided. An older species, now gone, had found them early and helped them reach the stars with a gentle hand, leaving behind technology and maps and knowledge. It was, by all accounts, a gift. Every species in the Accord had something like this: a hand extended, a door opened, a moment where the galaxy said, "You are not alone," and the species in question stepped through into something larger. Humanity had none of that. Humanity climbed out of its cradle world alone, with nobody watching and nobody helping, on a planet that had been actively trying to kill them for the entirety of their existence. Their world had predators larger and stronger than they were. It had diseases that changed faster than medicine could catch them. It had ice ages, droughts, floods, and geological events that wiped out whole populations and left the survivors to start over. And layered on top of all of that, humanity fought itself, long, terrible wars, over land and resources and beliefs, and sometimes just because the group on the other side of the river was different, and that felt like a reason. They nearly went extinct 6 times before they built their first spaceship. 6 times. Ketra had checked the number twice because he hadn't believed it. And somehow, every time they came back. They did not come back because something saved them. They came back because enough of them refused to stop, refused to lie down, refused to accept that this was the end. They were, by any scientific measure, not the strongest creatures on their world, not the fastest, not the most physically powerful. What they had was the ability to think their way through problems, to work together in groups, to pass knowledge down through generations, and to hold onto the will to survive long after it would have made logical sense to let go. They reached space carrying all of that with them. All of it. The wars and the plagues and the near extinctions and the memories of what it cost to still be standing. They brought it into the stars the same way a person who survived a very bad winter brings their coat even when the weather seems warm. They never stopped being the species that survived 6 extinctions. The Council had looked at humanity and seen a young, aggressive, rule-breaking civilization that needed to be managed. Ketra looked at the same history and saw something that made him want to go back into that chamber and overturn every throne in it. By the time the 72 hours ended with no response, the Council voted quickly, and with slightly less certainty than before, though nobody admitted that, to move forward with the first military action. The Voreth Vanguard fleet was chosen. 300 ships, the most decorated armada in the Accord. Their commander, Fleet Master Joreth, was experienced and capable, and he accepted the assignment with the calm confidence of someone who had won every battle he had ever fought. His target was Harrow's Edge, a human colony on the outer frontier. medium-sized, lightly defended by last intelligence report, situated in a system with no strategic backup. The plan was simple: arrive, demonstrate force, demand the colony's surrender, and establish it as a sign to the rest of human space that the Council's declaration was not empty words. Joreth was not worried. He had fought harder opponents for lesser reasons. What nobody on the Council had noticed, because they were not looking, and because they did not think it mattered, was what humanity had been doing during those 72 hours of silence. They had not been panicking. They had not been arguing. They had not been calling emergency meetings or trying to find diplomatic back channels or drafting apology letters. They had been working. On the ISV Relentless, Lyra had spent the entire 72 hours on very little sleep and a great deal of coffee, sending and receiving short, encrypted messages that went out to destinations across human space. She did not send orders. She sent a request. One clear, simple request, and she signed it with her name and her rank and nothing else. The response came back within hours. From old veterans who had been sitting in retirement on colony worlds. From young pilots fresh out of training who had heard the transmission and were already walking toward their ships. From engineers and doctors and scientists who also happened to know how to fight. From merchant captains who redirected their routes without being asked. From small frontier stations that pooled their single patrol ships and asked where they were needed. Humanity did not have a single massive military command that gave orders and expected obedience. It had never worked that way and probably never would. What it had instead was a shared understanding, old as the species, worn into the bone, of what it meant when something came at the people you loved, and what was expected of you when it did. You showed up, you brought what you had, and you did not stop. The Council's tactical systems, watching human space for signs of military buildup, saw something confusing. Human ships were moving, yes, but not massing. They were spreading out, going in different directions, dispersing across a wide arc of space in what looked, to every model the Council ran, like a disorganized retreat, like a population scattering in fear. In the Voreth Tactical Center, the analysts labeled it uncoordinated withdrawal under pressure of declaration, and logged it as a sign of low morale. Ketra saw the same data and did not log it as anything. He stared at the screen for a long time, watching the scattered pattern of moving ships, and thought about an old word he had read in a human file during those 40 hours of research. The word was hunting. When the Voreth Vanguard fleet prepared to jump to Harrow's Edge, Ketra quietly filed a request to be informed of the result the moment contact was made. He did not file it with confidence. He filed it the way you check a lock you are almost sure you remembered to close, because the cost of being wrong is too high not to check. The jump was made. 300 ships crossed the dark between stars. Ketra waited. The stars outside his window looked the same as always. Cold and far away and completely indifferent to what was about to happen. He pressed 4 hands together, a Voreth habit, done when one was trying to be patient, and he waited. The silence from Harrow's Edge was different from the silence of the last 72 hours. This silence had weight. The Voreth Vanguard fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel in perfect formation. 300 ships, arranged the way Fleet Master Joreth always arranged them, a wide forward wedge, support vessels in the middle, heavy guns along the outer edges. Clean, professional, the kind of formation that had won battles across 6 different systems and 2 different wars. Joreth stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Voreth Eternal, and looked at the view screen as the star system of Harrow's Edge resolved into focus. He had expected a colony. Domes, maybe, power signatures, defense platforms of some kind, old ones probably, given the last intelligence report, some panicked hails asking for terms. The system was quiet. He leaned forward in his command chair. "Scan the 3rd planet," he said. His scan officer was already working. The silence that followed lasted about 15 seconds, which was long enough for Jorath to feel the first small thread of something he did not want to name. "Sir," the officer said slowly, "the planet is reading cold. No power output, no atmospheric processors running, no population signals. Life signs? None." Jorath stood up and walked to the scan console himself. He looked at the data. The colony world of Harrow's Edge, home to 300,000 people according to the last council census, was empty. Not bombed, not destroyed. Just empty the way a house is empty when the family has packed its things and left. The structures were still standing. The roads were still there. The landing pads were intact. There was no one home. In the center of the colony, where the main settlement sat, one signal was transmitting. A single beacon, broadcasting on all frequencies, in clean Voreth dialect, so there would be no confusion about who the message was for. Jorath listened to it once. "You aimed at the wrong target. ISV relentless." He did not understand what that meant, not yet, but something in the back of his mind, the part that had survived 60 years of warfare through instinct as much as training, told him to order the fleet to raise shields. He gave that order. He gave it 3 seconds too late. The attack did not come from one direction. That was the first thing the post-battle analysts would note later when they tried to piece together what had happened. Every battle doctrine the Council used, and that the Voreth specifically were trained in, assumed that an attacking force would come from a position, a direction, a point in space from which the enemy could be identified, targeted, and engaged. Lyra did not come from a position. She came from several. The Relentless and the 14 ships she had gathered in the hours before this moment were small, fast, and had spent the last 18 hours sitting very still inside the asteroid belt on the far edge of the Harrow's Edge system, running on minimum power, cold and dark, waiting. Several of them had hidden in the long shadow of the colony's moon, tucked in close to the surface where the rock disrupted scan signals. 2 had gone even further. They had powered down entirely and drifted, running on emergency life support, silent as dead metal. They were not trying to destroy the Vanguard fleet. 300 ships against 15, that math did not work. They were not fighting the ships at all. Lyra's targets were the fleet's communication relays, the 4 automated buoys the Vanguard had deployed on arrival to maintain contact with Council space. She hit them in the first 30 seconds, all 4, with precision strikes that took out every relay before a single distress signal could be sent. Then she hit the fleet's resupply vessel, a large slow ship sitting at the back of the formation. She did not destroy it. She disabled it, a series of focused shots to its engine array and fuel lines that left the ship floating and intact but completely unable to move or provide fuel to the warships that needed it. Then she hit the flagship sensor array. The Voreth Eternal was suddenly flying blind. Jorath was shouting orders. His bridge crew was working fast, trying to identify targets that kept moving, that split apart and came from different angles, that fired and then went dark before the return shot could track them. The Vanguard was 300 ships trying to fight an enemy that would not hold still and would not stand in one place, and it was like trying to grab smoke. The battle lasted 40 minutes. In those 40 minutes, the Vanguard lost 11 ships, not to destruction, but to disabling hits that took out engines or weapons or power systems. 22 more took damage. The Relentless and her group lost 1 ship, a small frigate whose pilot had pushed too close too fast, and 3 others took light damage. Then the message came. Not on any official frequency. On a personal channel, encrypted to Fleet Master Jorath's private command code, which meant the sender had somehow gotten access to that code, which was itself a message of its own kind. Fleet Master Jorath, you have lost your communications, your fuel supply, and your ability to see clearly. You can continue this engagement and we will take more ships apart piece by piece until you have nothing left. Or you can leave, go back to Council space and tell them what happened here. I would prefer you choose the second option. There has been enough damage for one day. Voss. Joreth read it twice. He was not a man who gave up easily. He had fought worse odds than this and won. But he had never fought an enemy who had read the battle so completely before it started, who had removed his ability to call for help, to resupply, and to see, before the first shot was even fired. He had never fought someone who offered him the chance to leave, not out of mercy, but because destroying him was not the point. He ordered the retreat. 300 ships folded back into FTL and disappeared from Harrow's Edge, leaving behind the silence they had arrived in, and one disabled resupply vessel, and 4 dead communication buoys. The colony world sat empty and intact under the light of its sun. When the Vanguard fleet's emergency signal reached Council space through a backup relay they had not known about, the Council chamber convened within the hour. Joreth's report was short and honest, because he was a soldier and soldiers who lie in their reports get other soldiers killed. He said what happened, all of it. He did not make it sound better than it was. The chamber was very quiet when he finished. Ambassador Drain spoke first. 300 ships, he said, very carefully as if he was not sure the words were right. 300 ships, Joreth confirmed. Against 15. Against 15, Ambassador, yes. Another long silence. The Dravathi representative's shell clicked rapidly, a sound that, in their language, meant something between this should not be possible, and I am reassessing several things I believe to be true. The Fenori pair looked at each other and said nothing. The Tharak representative's stone-gray face did not change, but his massive hands pressed flat on his armrest in a way that suggested he was holding himself still deliberately. Drain said after a while, "They knew we were coming." "They knew we were coming," Joreth agreed. "They evacuated the colony before we arrived. Every civilian, 300,000 people, moved without any Council intelligence service detecting it. They left a message for us in our own dialect, telling us we had aimed at the wrong target." "Which means they chose that target," Ketra said from his seat quietly. Everyone looked at him. "They chose to let us come to Harrow's Edge," he said. "They chose that system. They evacuated it, set the ambush, let us walk into it, hurt us enough to send a message, and then let us leave. They did not try to destroy the fleet." He paused. "They were not trying to win that engagement. They were trying to teach us something." The chamber was quiet again. Drain said, with the stiffness of a man who has decided that the right answer is to apply more force to a problem, "Then we teach them something in return. We call the full accord Armada." The vote was 5 in favor. Ketra abstained. He did not argue, did not object, did not make a speech. He simply did not raise his hand. After the session ended, he went back to his office and sat alone for a long time. Then he opened a private channel and began composing a message, not to the Council, not to any military command. He addressed it to Commander Lyra Voss, ISV Relentless. He did not know if she would answer. He did not know if reaching out to her was the right move or a futile one. But he was old, and he had seen enough wars to know that the best time to talk was before things became impossible to stop, and he was beginning to feel, in the deep cold place in his chest that had not warmed since the day of the declaration, that impossible was getting close. He wrote one sentence. Then he waited. Back on Harrow's Edge, Lyra stood in the empty main settlement and looked at the quiet streets. The lights were off. The doors were closed. Children's toys sat in yards exactly where they had been left the day the evacuation order came through. A mug still sat on a porch railing, left behind in the hurry to go. Someone's home, someone's ordinary life interrupted. She looked at it for a long time. Then she walked back to her shuttle, and she got to work. 4,000 ships was a number that was supposed to end arguments. The Galactic Accord Armada had not been fully assembled in over 100 years. It was not kept in one place. No station could hold it, no single system could supply it, so it existed mostly as a list of commitments, a promise each member species made when they signed the accord. That if the full armada was ever called, they would send what they had pledged. Some of them sent a little less than pledged, as they always did, and some sent exactly what they promised. And when it was all added together and arranged in the wide, empty space at the edge of human frontier, it was the largest fleet the current generation of any species had ever seen in one place. 16 species, 4,000 ships, weapons that ranged from old but reliable to experimental and untested. It stretched across the void like a city made of metal and engines, and when its combined sensor arrays pointed at human space, it could see very far indeed. The Council was, for the first time since the Declaration, comfortable again. Fleet General Ashari of the Sulking took command of the Armada. She was a careful, thorough officer who had planned this kind of operation before: large-scale, multi-species coordination, the kind of campaign where the main challenge was not defeating the enemy but keeping 4,000 ships from getting in each other's way. She drew up a plan. It was a good plan, solid and well-organized, built on the assumption that humanity would be forced to defend its territory and that the Armada would simply be too large to stop. She transmitted the plan to the Council. They approved it with minimal changes. Ketra read the plan and then set it down and did not say anything, because he had already said everything he had to say and no one had listened. And there was a point at which saying the same true thing over and over again stopped being wisdom and started being noise. He had, however, received an answer to his message. It was short, 3 words and a question. "What do you want?" He had written back, and they had begun to talk. The Armada moved into human frontier space on the 43rd day after the Declaration. What it found at the first target system, a mid-sized colony called Varen's Post, was a fortified shell. The people were gone. They had been gone for days, moved out through routes that left no trace the Armada's scouts could follow. What remained were the structures, and inside those structures, layer after layer of automated defense systems, mines, booby traps, and carefully placed explosives that turned every building into a potential weapon. The colony had been converted from a home into a maze, and the maze was designed not to hold the Armada off forever, but to cost it time, fuel, ammunition, and ships in exchange for ground that no longer mattered because the people it was meant to protect were already somewhere else. Ashari noted this and adjusted her plan. She would bypass fortified colonies and strike at the open supply lines instead. The supply lines were gone. Or rather, they had changed. Human resupply ran through dozens of small, unmarked routes that shifted position regularly, carried by vessels with minimal power signatures that were nearly impossible to track at long range. The Armada's scouts found a few of them. Most of them vanished before they could be intercepted. She adjusted again. She would strike at the human shipyards, the places where their vessels were being built and repaired. The shipyards had been relocated. Not all of them and not quickly, but enough that every time the Armada found what looked like a major target, it turned out to be a secondary facility or an empty shell. The primary construction had moved to smaller, dispersed locations hidden inside asteroid fields and deep system shadows. And while the Armada was searching, and adjusting and searching again, the attacks on its edges never stopped. They were not large attacks. They never came from a big force. They came from small groups of fast ships that appeared, hit something specific, a fuel depot, a communication relay, a repair vessel, a sensor platform, and then disappeared before the Armada's response could reach them. No single attack was devastating, but they were relentless and they were precise, and over weeks they added up in a way that the Armada's logistics officers tracked in reports that got longer and more worried every time. Ashari was a careful officer, and she did not panic. But on the 61st day, she sent a report to the council that was the most honest thing she had ever written in her career. She said that the Armada was making slow progress. She said that it was not fighting the war it had been built to fight. She said that the human strategy appeared to be designed to make every advance expensive and every victory empty, and that she did not currently see a clear path to the kind of decisive engagement that would end this conflict quickly. She did not recommend retreat. She recommended patience and resources, more supply ships, more scouts, more time. The council gave her what it could, which was less than she asked for, because 3 of the member species were already experiencing economic disruptions from having their military assets committed to the Armada for 2 months, and the economies of space-faring civilizations, it turned out, did not enjoy being put on hold indefinitely. Ketra and Lyra had been talking for 3 weeks by the time he asked her the question. They talked in short messages, never long, always encrypted, through a relay chain that Ketra had set up himself using methods he had learned in his first decade as a military intelligence officer, and had hoped never to need for something like this. He was, technically, in violation of at least 2 council communication protocols by doing it. He had decided he did not care. He had told her things, honest things about the council, about the Armada, about the state of the war as he saw it. Not because he was betraying his people, he did not think of it that way, but because he was old enough to understand that wars which cannot end quickly tend to end badly for everyone, and the only way to end this one was for someone on each side to be honest. She had told him things too, not military details. He had not asked for those and she would not have given them, but things about humanity, about why they were fighting this way instead of massing for a direct engagement, about what they wanted, or more accurately, what they did not want. They did not want territory. They did not want council resources or council technology or any piece of what the council had. They were not fighting to conquer. They were not fighting out of anger, even though they had plenty of reason for it. They were fighting because someone had pointed a fleet at the people they loved, and the only response that made sense was to make that too expensive to continue. On the 65th day, Ketra wrote her the question he had been building toward for 3 weeks. What would it take, he asked, for your people to stop? The answer came back in 4 words. We want to be left alone. He read it several times. It was simple. It was almost too simple. He thought about the 11 trade violations, the bioscan refusals, the colonies in protected space. He thought about the 6 recorded incidents of telling council representatives to leave. He thought about all of it laid out in Drain's long list, and he thought about those 4 words, and slowly a picture assembled itself in his mind. Humanity had not been building toward this war. Humanity had been trying, in ways that were admittedly blunt and often rude, to stay out of the council's business. Every violation on that list was an act of refusal, not aggression. Every incident was a door being closed, not a fist being raised. The council had taken those closed doors as disrespect, as primitive behavior, as a problem to be corrected. Humanity had taken the council's correction as a threat to the people they loved. And when someone threatened the people they loved, 4,000 years of hard survival instinct did not ask about diplomatic protocol. Ketra sat with this for a long time, then he wrote back. I think that can be arranged, but I will need time, and I will need the war to not get worse while I work on it. Her answer came back in under an hour. Then let's talk about what that looks like. It was on the 78th day that the human engineers project became ready. Lyra had not called it a weapon. Myra had pointed out that technically it was not a weapon, which was true. It was a blockade system, a series of automated mines, relay stations, and communication disruptors that, once deployed in the right configuration, could effectively seal the Kessel Corridor, the single most important transit route between the Armada's current position and the interior of Council space. If the corridor was sealed, the armada could not be resupplied. It could not retreat cleanly. It could not receive reinforcements. It would be bottled, intact, alive, not destroyed, but completely unable to move forward or backward without fighting through the blockade at enormous cost. It took 47 human ships to deploy it. It was done over the course of 6 hours, in 3 shifts, without a single Council sensor platform detecting it, because the human engineers had spent 2 weeks making sure every piece of the system ran cold until the moment it was activated. Lyra activated it on the 79th day. She did not announce it. She did not send a message to the Council or to Ashari or to anyone. She simply turned it on and waited for the Armada's scouts to find it. They found it in about 4 hours. Ashari's report to the Council that evening was shorter than her previous ones. It had only 2 sentences that mattered. "We are blocked. I am requesting new orders." In the Council chamber, someone suggested calling Lyra's move a bluff. Ketra said quietly that in his experience humanity did not bluff. They set traps. There was a difference. He did not say this to be difficult. He said it because it was true, and because time was running out and he had a plan, but only if the Council would listen. For the first time in this entire war, the chamber went quiet in a way that meant they might actually be ready to hear something. The chamber had not been this quiet since the day of the declaration. That first quiet had been the quiet of confidence. 6 ambassadors pleased with a decision they thought was already resolved, settling back into their chairs with the comfortable belief that the hard part was behind them. This quiet was different. This was the quiet of people looking at a map and realizing, with slow and unwilling certainty, that every route they thought they had was no longer where they remembered it. 4 months. The war had been running for 4 months. Ketra stood at the center of the chamber, where Drain usually stood, and he spoke slowly because he wanted every word to land clearly and stay there. He told them about the Armada first. Ashari's fleet was intact, no mass casualties, no catastrophic losses, but it was stopped. The Kessel Corridor blockade was real, it was deep, and his own tactical people had spent 3 days trying to find a clean way through it and come back with nothing. Going through it by force was possible, but the cost projection was ugly enough that 2 of the Armada's species commanders had already submitted formal requests to withdraw their fleets if a resolution was not reached within 30 days. He told them about the economics next. 3 member species were in formal economic distress. The Fenori homeworld had slowed its trade output by 40% because its merchant fleet had been on military standby for 4 months. The Dravathi were quieter about it, but their trade ministry had been sending signals that Ketra's office had intercepted, not out of any espionage, but because the Dravathi signals had been getting louder and less careful, which was a sure sign that someone was worried and not bothering to hide it anymore. He told them, finally, about the whisper that had been moving through 3 of the outer member species for 6 weeks, the word secession. Nobody had said it out loud in official sessions, but it was there, in private conversations, in closed-channel messages, in the careful silences of ambassadors who were looking at their homeworld's ledgers and starting to ask whether the Accord's war was their war. The chamber stayed quiet. Drain, to his credit, did not interrupt. He listened to all of it with his 6-fingered hands folded on his knee and his expression controlled and still. Then he said, "And you have a solution." "I have a conversation," Ketra said. "I have been having it for 3 weeks. I believe an agreement is reachable." "With her?" "With Commander Voss, yes." There was a pause. "She does not represent the human government," the Tharak representative said. His voice was deep and slow, like rocks grinding together. "She is a single military officer. She is the person who evacuated 300,000 civilians from Harrow's Edge before we arrived," Ketra said. "She is the person who disabled the Vanguard fleet with 15 ships. She is the person who built and deployed the blockade, currently holding 4,000 of our ships in place." He paused. "I am less concerned with her title and more concerned with the fact that she is the most effective human military actor in this conflict. And she has been talking to me, and she has told me what it would take to stop." Another pause. "Which is?" Drain asked. "To be left alone," Ketra said. The chamber sat with that. Lyra received the Council's request for a formal transmission window on the 80th day. She read it twice, told Myra she would need 30 minutes, and then sat alone on the bridge with the lights low and her coffee hot, actually hot this time because she had made it fresh, and she thought carefully about what she was about to do. She was not a diplomat. She had never claimed to be, and she was honest enough with herself to know that this part, the talking part, the ending it part, was harder for her than the fighting had been. Fighting had rules she understood. You could read a battlefield, see the shape of it, make a decision and act on it. Talking was different. Talking was trying to reshape something that had already been built badly and get it to hold weight anyway. But she was also tired. Not broken tired, not the kind of tired that means you are done. The kind of tired that meant she had been doing this long enough that finishing it correctly had become more important than anything else. She thought about the mug on the porch railing at Harrow's Edge. Someone's ordinary morning, interrupted. She thought about the pilot they had lost in the Vanguard engagement, a 23-year-old from a colony in the outer belt who had wanted to be a ship designer before the declaration came through and changed his plans. She thought about the 300,000 people who were living in temporary housing on 4 different colony worlds, waiting to go home. She thought about what finally had meant the night she said it. It had not meant that she was happy about this. It had not meant she had wanted a war. It had meant that the long, uncomfortable in-between was over. The years of closed doors and refusals, and telling council representatives to leave, the slow, escalating pressure of a governing body that had decided humanity needed to be managed, all of that had been building towards something, and now the something had arrived, and at least a thing that had arrived could be dealt with. A thing that was still approaching could only be worried about. She was done worrying. She was ready to deal with it. She finished her coffee, straightened in her chair, and opened the channel. The transmission came through live to the council chamber. Lyra's face appeared on the main display, small screen, plain background, the kind of image that a ship's internal camera produces, nothing staged about it. She looked exactly like what she was, someone sitting at their workstation who had things to do and was choosing to spend a portion of her time on this. She did not greet them warmly. She did not greet them coldly either. She simply said, "I understand you want to talk. I will say what I have to say, and then you can ask questions." Drain nodded once. She spoke for about 8 minutes. She said it plainly, in the kind of simple and direct language that left very little room to be misunderstood. Humanity would remain sovereign. Its government, its laws, its decisions about its own people and its own space, not subject to council authority, not now, not under new terms, not under modified terms. The sovereignty was the foundation, and it was not movable. The colonies humanity had established in protected space were humanity's colonies. The systems they were in were dead worlds with no native life, and the protection placed on them had been done without human input or agreement, so that protection did not apply. The bioscan mandates were refused, as they had always been refused. Humanity's population data was its own. The trade agreements would be renegotiated. Not canceled, renegotiated by representatives sitting across a table as equals, not as a governing body and a managed species. Equal parties, equal voices. If the council could agree to that, there was a framework for trade that could work for everyone. There would be no apology from humanity for any of the listed violations, because humanity did not believe it had done anything that required an apology. And going forward, the Galactic Accord Council would operate on the clear understanding that humanity was not a member civilization. It was a neighbor. Neighbors could have agreements. Neighbors could have trade. Neighbors could have communication channels and maybe, in time, a decent working relationship. But a neighbor was not subject to the rules of the household next door. And anyone who came to humanity's door with a fleet, instead of a conversation, should expect humanity to answer accordingly. She paused after that last part, just for a moment. "I want to be very clear," she said. "We did not start this. We pushed back hard when it started, and I think the last 4 months have demonstrated that we can push back harder if that becomes necessary. We are not interested in destroying the Accord. We are not interested in any of your territory or any of your resources. What happened here was expensive and painful for people on both sides, and none of it had to happen. I would prefer it does not happen again." "I think you would prefer that too." She looked directly at the camera. "I think we understand each other," she said. "Now it is your turn." The council deliberated for 2 days. It would have taken longer, but the Fenari sent a private message on the second day indicating that if a resolution was not reached by the end of the week, they would be withdrawing their fleet commitment, and that message moved the timeline noticeably. The vote, when it came, was 5 in favor of accepting Lyra's terms. 1 member, the sulking second chair representative, not Drain himself, who had retreated into a stiff silence that might have been dignity or might have been the look of a man reevaluating his career choices, voted against, and was quietly removed from his position by the sulking government within the week, because even the sulking had looked at the last 4 months and decided they were ready for this to be over. Ketra was last to vote. He sat for a moment with his hand above the confirmation panel. He thought about the words he had said in this chamber 4 months ago. You have never seen them truly angry, and about the 6 votes that had not listened. He thought about 30,000 years of Voreth history, and the war that had taught his people that going to space together was better than dying apart. He thought about a species that had survived 6 extinctions and carried all of it with them into the stars, every single scar. He pressed his hand to the panel. The confirmation registered. The agreement was sealed. The blockade powered down in sections over the following 12 hours, and the Armada withdrew in good order, and the announcement went out across all frequencies in all languages, and in temporary housing on 4 colony worlds, 300,000 people started making plans to go home. On the bridge of the ISV Relentless, Myra processed the final confirmation and let a few seconds pass before she spoke. She did not do it to be dramatic. She did it because the moment seemed like it deserved a few seconds. "It's over, Commander," she said. Lyra was already at the viewport. She had her coffee, a fresh one, hot, held in both hands, and she was looking at the stars the way she always looked at them when she was thinking, steady and quiet and very still. She thought about the word finally and what it had cost and what it had meant. She thought about the mug on the porch railing and the young pilot from the outer belt and 300,000 people going home. She thought about humanity, not as an idea, not as a symbol, but as a collection of specific people in specific places who had trusted her and shown up and done what needed doing, and were now going to get to go back to the ordinary lives that the declaration had interrupted. She took a slow sip of her coffee. "No," she said simply, and her voice was quiet and level and completely certain. "It's starting." Myra processed that for a moment. "The negotiations for the trade framework begin in 3 weeks, she offered. "I know. Admiral Ketra has requested a face-to-face meeting. He says he would like to talk without encryption for once." "I know. There are also 14 new volunteer requests from ships that want a crew under your command going forward, and 2 colony governors who want to speak with you about permanent frontier defense arrangements." Lyra was quiet for a moment. Then something that was not quite a smile but was close to one moved across her face. "Tell them I will get back to them," she said. She turned from the viewport and walked to her console, and she sat down, and she got to work. Outside the ship, the stars were the same as they had always been, cold and far away and indifferent to the wars of small creatures in the dark between them. They had been there before humanity climbed out of its cradle world. They would be there long after. But humanity was out there now too, moving through the dark with all its scars and its stubbornness and its deep and total refusal to stop. Not because it was the strongest species, or the fastest, or the most powerful. Because it was the one that, when everything came at it, looked up at the stars and said finally, and meant it. End of story.